Young Justice Season 4 began a brand new arc this week over on HBO Max. That newest episode was entitled Obnu. I'm Cape Joel, and this is the video series where I give my thoughts and feelings on the episode that was, as well as shouting out any comic book Easter eggs or references I can find. And oh, let me tell you, there was a lot of them this week, so let's get to it. First things first, what's the deal with that title? Well, Obnu is of course undone, written backwards, and that's because this newest story arc looks to be all about the magical side of the Young Justice universe, and as we've seen time and time again with Zatana, saying stuff backwards is a big old part of magic here. Furthermore, this episode really goes out of its way to set a different kind of tone right out of the gate. We hear a booming and mysterious voice telling us all about the birth of the universe, and oh yeah, in classic DC fashion, it's heavily implied that this isn't even the first universe we're on right now. We are also reminded of the eternal struggle between the Lords of Chaos and the Lords of Order respectively, who, as the mysterious voice reminds us, don't always fall into the regular binary good or evil paradigm like you might think. To them, it's all about finding a balance. Evil is totally fine so long as it brings order, and good could be seen as bad if it threatens said balance. This intro also not so subtly reminded me of the lore that the Young Justice show had set up last season, and that is Nabu, the Lord of Order and spirit within Dr. Fate's magical helmet, was implied to actually be a child of Vandal Savage. At the time, I thought that was a pretty big bomb to drop, and I'm thankful that Obnu actually does a lot to bridge the gap between Vandal's ongoing story and the story that's just beginning with the magical world. Now, new magical threats are going to need a magical team to combat them, and as we learn within the last year of showtime, Zatana has taken 3 very promising young magic users under her wing to form a kind of magical subsect of the Young Justice team. Some of these people we already know, like Tracy 13 and her amazing abilities to control bad luck fields. We had seen her ever so briefly in the previous season, and now she's back. We also have some pretty big newcomers too, like Khalid, back of the throat. I like ever since Shang-Chi superhero media is not afraid anymore for non-white heroes to tell fans that they've been saying their names wrong this whole time. Now, you might not know this, but in the comics, Khalid was actually a newer version of Dr. Fate. Then he wasn't anymore, and then him and Kent Nelson kind of became co-Dr. Fates by the end. Don't be surprised if by the end of this arc he ends up putting on the helmet of fate. In fact, I would be willing to put money on it. And lastly, of course, who could possibly forget Mary Marvel, a longtime fan favorite and member of the Shazam Marvel family, though maybe not the extended Bats and Foster family in this universe because she's using her old last name. Actually, come to think of it, Mary may not have ever been Mary Marvel in this universe. Instead, she makes reference to being Sergeant Shazam, just one of the many alternate names she used in the comics. In fact, this episode is positively loaded with references to old Shazam Captain Marvel comics. My personal favorite is Mary getting on a tiger at the merry-go-round and referring to it as Mr. Tawny. FYI, Talkie Tawny was a actual anthropomorphized tiger man who often hung out with Billy and Mary back in the day, and still kind of does now. This new team's training is coming along slowly but surely. Unfortunately, they all get thrown into the deep end when a new Lord of Chaos comes to Earth looking to make trouble, not only for them, but seemingly for Clarion too. This event sends shockwaves all throughout the magical world, even reaching the ears of the Witch Boy himself during a Light meeting. I absolutely love this scene too, because the Light's agent in Markovia is saying a lot of very important stuff about Brion and the future of the metahuman weapons program, but Clarion could really care less. Now, chances are, if you're like me, you've probably been wondering since the show began how exactly Vandal Savage and the Light are able to control someone like Clarion, who is basically a Lovecraftian old god of limitless power. Well, we learn the answer to that and many more burning questions in this episode's hard-working but not exactly motion-filled B-story. As it turns out, in ancient times when Vandal Savage, then called Vandor, had actually created an entire community for his amazing superpowered children and their ilk, basically the proto-metahumans. Which, within the creation myth of the show, we can now take to mean the entire meta-gene as we know it on Earth is traced back to Vandal, and by extension the meteor that gave him his amazing eternal life. Now, this isn't really the case in the comics, but for a TV show, I think it's a nice, clean way to explain Savage's own obsession and expertise when it comes to creating new metahuman weapons. It also kind of ends up tying into a much bigger theme later on, and that is the science fiction-y root that Vandal draws his power from versus all this old-timey ancient magic. For you see, Vandor's happy community was shattered one day by the coming of Clarion, who murdered all of his people just kind of because he could, and well, hey, chaos, don't you know? Try though he might though, the witch boy could not kill Vandal, even with his ancient chaos magic. Intrigued by one another, they ended up striking an unlikely bargain. Clarion would let Vandal's remaining children live, and in return, Vandal would spend the next 1,000 years trying to build something that could impress the unimpressible Clarion. Wow, man, Devil's deals with Darkseid and Clarion. Vandal has himself a real gambling problem, doesn't he? It's also probably important to note that this is the second time now where we've looked into Vandal's past, and despite him being set up as the main big bad for all of Young Justice, we can see that his path to villainy was often paved with good intentions. Save his people, save the Earth. He didn't set out to be a cruel or evil tyrant, that just kinda happened. Again, order isn't always good and chaos isn't always evil. Oh, and one last thing before we move on to what was the name of Vandal's idyllic community? Oh, it was just called Atlantis, meaning that Vandal founded Atlantis before it sunk before the waves. Meaning that not only does every metahuman on Earth have trace amounts of Savage's own DNA within them, but probably a lot of the Atlanteans too, as Vandal was their first king. Man, Genghis Khan would be mighty proud of Vandal Savage. That is assuming that Vandal Savage wasn't also just Genghis Khan. Now what about that new Lord of Chaos I mentioned before? Well, let me introduce you to Child and her familiar, the Crystal Giant Flaw. I know I say this all the time with this show, but what a crazy deep cut. Child is actually from 80s Keith Geffen Gemworld stories, and even as a hardcore comic superfan, I know precious little about Gemworld. I do know, though, in the comics, Child was presented as male, but because Child is very clearly here meant to be a foil for both the heroes and Clarion, having a witch girl in the show makes a lot of sense. Fun fact, Child and Mary are both voiced in this episode by performer, actress, and professional D&D player Erika Ishii. She's no joke one of my favorite internet people, period, and I just wanted to stop and tell you all that I think she's great and brings a lot of great energy to both roles. Believe it or not, this episode also had an even smaller C-plot involving Beast Boy and his continued spiral into depression. It's gotten so bad that Blue Devil, the Outsider's newest den mother, can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. We've seen Blue Devil before in the background in much smaller roles in season past, but I gotta say I love what they do with him here. A little Scottish brew can go a long way when it comes to making a character like this endearing. Plus, Blue Devil was a member of Shadow Pack, which is basically the Paranormal Justice League, so it makes sense to have him here in this arc. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if he gets involved in the main plot. Now back with Zatana and her crew, they look for clues about the coming of Child. On the way, Mary opens up about actually having had a previous stint as a traditional superhero before dedicating herself fully to magic. The implication is that something very, very bad happened. Again, if you know your comics like I do, you can probably guess what she was talking about. Involved a certain cult favorite black suit. Word is Greg Weisman and company actually had a lot planned for Mary and Freddy and the whole assorted Marvel family in the spin-off Young Justice comics that never got to see their way to fruition. As it turns out, Zatana's big contact is none other than Madame Xanadu, which might seem weird at first considering in Season 1, the first Dr. Fate episode, no less, they played Madame Xanadu as one big joke, a con woman with no real magic powers. Well, it seems off-screen she actually became the great seer she is in the comics, thanks in no small part to her interaction with Kent Nelson. Well, that sure is convenient, isn't it? And also, wow, Young Justice sure loves paying off storylines way down the line, don't they? By the time the heroes ultimately pick up Child's trail, she's already killed, and very gruesomely too. This episode might actually have more blood and gore than any in the season so far. What follows is a comedy of errors. Clarion assumes that Zatana and her team are to blame for the magical disturbance, and likewise the good guys blame probably one of their oldest foes at this point. We get treated to a good old-fashioned wizard duel, and honestly I'm happy after the last arc had so much action in it, there's still enough money left over to make these fight scenes exciting and dynamic as I hoped they would be. Clarion manages to get the upper hand, or hands in this case, on the inexperienced super team, but before he can kill them, he gets summoned away by Child to Roanoke Island. In fact, he gets summoned in a scene that very much mirrors Clarion's own summoning of the other evil magic users from the episode Misplaced. It seems that the Lords of Chaos are genuinely ticked off at Clarion and his behavior, and as as such, they've called him in for the mother of all peer reviews. Oh, but wait, we're still not done yet, because as the episode ends, Vandal takes a meeting with the mysterious narrator we've been hearing all episode long. Turns out it's none other than the Phantom frickin' Stranger. And again, if you don't regularly read comics like me, you probably don't know what a big deal this dude is. Him and the Spectre are like the two biggest, most powerful magical beings who only ever come around and get involved in the lives of mortals when shit's about to go down. And hey, that's the stinger for ya. And so that was Obnu, everybody, an episode that kicked off this newest arc by backloading us with a ton of new revelations, new characters, and the return of old favorites. In fact, I dare say maybe this episode tries to do too much all at once. Lots of cool stuff happens, but not a lot of it gets the time it needs to breathe because we gotta move on to the next big thing. This has always been a pitfall though when it comes to DC and the magical side of their universe. Writers tend to spend so much time explaining stuff and not enough time just letting it happen. This probably explains why, despite having such a loyal fan base, the magical heroes and villains are so often neglected in the comic books. I appreciate Wiseman and company for not letting that happen here in the show by dedicating an entire episode to the magical scene. I just hope the next episode is able to slow down, calm down, and maybe get a little bit more focused on the bits and pieces. So then, looks like that'll just about do it for me in another week, everyone. Again, thank you so much for watching and listening. Your likes, favorites, and comments have been doing great things for my channel. As always, I'd ask you to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and all my other social media outlets so you always know when the next Young Justice video is set to drop. Until then, everyone, this has been Cape Joel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all again next time.